Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we will be speaking with best-selling author Russell Shorto about his new book, Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. Drawing on meticulous research, Shorto uncovers the riveting story behind the 1664 English takeover of Dutch New Amsterdam. The transition occurred not through violent conquest, but through a remarkable series of negotiations between two visionary leaders. Their efforts laid the foundation for a multi-ethnic, capitalistic society, one that would come to define the spirit of New York City and, eventually, the nation that formed around it. I'd now like to welcome Russell Shorto to our show. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you very much, James. Happy to be with you.
I'm very happy to have you because I have just finished your new book, Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. What a fantastic book, Russell. It is so interesting.
Well, that's great to hear. Glad you liked it.
Yeah, I live about, I think it's 18 miles west of Manhattan. And my wife is from New York. She's actually from Brooklyn. It's really about our home for all intents and purposes here in North Jersey. It's so close.
Yeah, and New Jersey was part of New Netherland, the Dutch colony.
Yes, and you've written some really widely acclaimed historical narratives, and one of them, and I think it's about 20 years ago now that you wrote it, it's called The Island at the Center of the World, and it's also about Manhattan. Can you tell us what's different about your new book from The Island at the Center of the World?
Yeah, you're right. I wrote The Island at the Center of the World about 20 years ago. It came out. And that book is about the Dutch colony of New Netherland. And it's basically the history of that colony, which existed for 40 years until the English took over and renamed it New York. And I wrote that book based on the translation project at the New York State Library and Archives in Albany, which has been going on since the 1970s, translating 12,000 pages of these 17th century handwritten Dutch records. I've stayed in touch with that translation project ever since, and I came to realize that in the last few years, they've gotten up to the end of the colony's life. And that last couple of years in the colony's life are when it's most consequential, when the capital of New Amsterdam at the tip of Manhattan Island is this booming little town that is trading. These people are trading with the Caribbean, with South America, with Western Europe. And it caused me to focus attention all over again on that end game, on that last moment, because you see this colony as the English saw it and as suddenly very desirable. It's like a piece of fruit that's slowly ripening and suddenly they want to pick it. So this book, Taking Manhattan, is about that moment. And it's basically 2 weeks in the late summer of 1664, and the English are in their ships in the harbor pointing their guns at the fort at the tip of the island, and the Dutch are in the fort pointing their guns back at them.
I was at the edge of my seat reading the book during those negotiations back and forth. I mean, I'm a person with a background in history. I majored in history in college, and there were some names that popped up that I really had never heard of, like Richard Nichols. That was a new one on me. And when I used to think about when so the Dutch had New Amsterdam there, and then the English kind of took over. I never really dove into how did they take over. What was that process? Was it a shots
Yeah,
fired? What happened?
yeah, that's what, I think we tend to look at things that happened in the past as inevitable. Yeah, the English, of course, were going to take over and then New York gets going. Or, of course, the Allies would win the Second World War. I mean, things didn't have to turn out the way they did, you know, and that's what makes history interesting when you're reading it or writing it. When you get down at the level of the people involved, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, are living in a moment of, we're living really in history now. I mean, I think until a few years ago, we were just kind of swimming in this, you know, everything will always be like this. But suddenly now we know, no, there are times when historical forces change and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. None of us knows. So in this case, that moment, the English suddenly wanted this, and the Dutch had this empire that stretched all around the world. They had this colony, which, as I said, the people in the colony, they'd really been booming. And they had wanted for years for the home country to give them more support. They kept writing letters saying, look, we've got this really interesting thing going. We've set aside the whole continent of North America. We can exploit this continent, but we need support. We need more settlers. We need soldiers. We need equipment. And the powers that be in the home country were more interested in places that they could make money in the short term, in Asia, in South America, in the Caribbean. So they were just not paying attention to them. Whereas in England, there was a very different story, which you mentioned Richard Nicolls. Richard Nicolls was the leader of this English expeditionary force, and he was given this mission by the King, Charles II, and his brother, James, the Duke of York. And specifically, it was the Duke of York and Richard Nicolls were very close. And he was given a mission to take over this Dutch colony because the Stuart government, the Stuart monarchy, was back on the throne after the English Civil War. And they wanted to start building an empire too. They had been long envious of the Dutch. And so they wanted to organize the American colonies. They had colonies in New England and they had some settlements to the south. But the Dutch had this prime piece in the middle, and suddenly they wanted it very badly.
Yes. And if I can, I'd like to turn back the clock. Can you talk to the original inhabitants of Manhattan Island?
Sure. The whole region around New York and New Jersey and south to Delaware was the territory of the people who were variously called the Lenape or the Munsee or the Delaware. And they're still here. They're still around. Some are in New Jersey. Others are further west. Some are in Canada. Um, and Manhattan seems to have been used seasonally as a hunting ground, not only by the Lenape, but by others in the area, the Shinnecock on Long Island, for example. And so this was all part of their territory. When the Dutch came, they quickly learned the landscape. They learned the Lenape people. They knew further up the Hudson River on the east side, you had the Mohicans. On the west side of the Hudson, you had the Mohawk, and then from there, the five nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois extend to the Seneca, the far western of those nations. Each of these groups speaks a different language. They have different customs. So it was a very complex world that the Dutch came in. And by the way, the Dutch themselves represented quite a bit of complexity because they were under Dutch auspices, but the Netherlands was kind of the melting pot of Europe at the time. So famously, the capital, New Amsterdam, at one point had at least 18 languages being spoken. So it was this European mix. So you think about this whole mix, complicated mix of different native peoples. Then you think about this this Dutch colony, which is itself this complicated mix of different peoples. And you start to, it's like you're playing three-dimensional chess or something. It's a really complicated game that's going on.
You know what really struck me, Russell, was the small quantities of settlers. These were not big, gigantic groups of people who came over. There were like handfuls of couples that were like sent out to start building things and raising families and farming. As a matter of fact, I think when the English come, isn't the New Amsterdam only about 1,500 people. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. The capital was 1,500 people. The whole colony had about 10,000 settlers at that time. So, yeah, if you go back 400 years, numbers are much smaller than they are now. And initially, around 1624, when the Dutch began sending settlers, it was the so-called Golden Age in the Netherlands, and it was hard to get people to venture to the middle of nowhere. And the people who did come, they were mostly Walloons from what's now part of Belgium, who were themselves immigrants to the Netherlands. And they were at the bottom of the social ladder, so they were the ones who didn't have much to lose and were looking for, some way to make something for themselves. And as you said, it was just, now I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but something like 8 or 10 couples and a small number of soldiers that were spread initially across this vast terrain, extending over, from upstate New York down south and into New Jersey. And the idea was just a few of them in each place because they're trying to, the point is, they're thinking about other European nations. They're trying to make a claim to this territory. And that means having families and having crops in the ground so they can say, look, we are settling this. But it was incredibly small numbers.
One of the things that really caught my interest in the book Taking Manhattan was that you told the stories of some of those people who were in New Amsterdam at the time the English came. One of whom, Catalina Trico, you mentioned her. She was there from the very beginning. She was one of those first couples. I think she was called, like, she and her husband were the Adam and Eve of the settlement. Well, strangely enough, I am a 10 times great grandson of Catalina Trico. So it really interested me to hear about this ancestor of mine and what she was like, and what her experience was. But what can you tell us about her?
Yeah, these were, and I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from people who are descendants of Catalina and Joris, her husband. They number in the millions now. That's the magic of just put time together and generations. They were Walloons from northern France or Belgium, and they came, I think, she was 18 and he was 19. I'm forgetting their exact ages, and they each showed up in Amsterdam. Amsterdam was, as I said, in the middle of its golden age, and it was building itself. Amsterdam, initially the medieval center. If you go to Amsterdam today, if you're like the red light district, the infamous red light district in Amsterdam is right in the medieval center of the city. That was the original city. Then around that, you have the canal ring, and this is, what all the tourists go to, and you ride boats in and all that. Um, that canal ring was built purposely. It was laid out and then built over a period of 60 or 70 years throughout the Golden Age. So it was thousands of homes, miles of roads, hundreds of bridges over the canals, all laid out and designed and then executed. And so people came from all over Europe to, they say that the official population of Amsterdam around that time was about 200,000, but a Dutch historian estimates that there may have been twice that number because you had so many people who were off the books who just came and in order to work. So presumably Catalina and Joris came because they were attracted by, there's work to be done. There's wealth there. Very shortly after they got there, they heard about this venture that the West India Company was gearing up for, and they signed up for it to go to this new colony and to stake out territory. And we don't know what means. Did they have placards, on the walls or something? How did they hear about it? And they signed up for it. So they were looking in particular for young couples because, as I said, they wanted to plant a colony. And they decided to get married beforehand, and they went into the Valse Kerk, the Walloon church in Amsterdam, which is still there. and they got married there. And then a couple of days later, they got on the ship and went to the ship sailed into New York Harbor, and then they were assigned with a few other couples to go 150 miles up the Hudson River to what would become Albany. They were part of the small group that built the very early foundations of that town. And they had this, just very difficult to comprehend, backbreaking, difficult work. If you know that part of upstate New York, I mean, you've got the wide Hudson River, you got this little settlement you can envision on the shores of it, and then to the west, the mountain rises in the forest behind you. So you got the river on one side, the forested mountain on the other, and then before long, native people started coming, and there were good relations, and the Dutch were there initially to do business with them. They didn't want to kind of get them out of the way or anything. They were there mainly to trade with the native people for furs. And the native people were interested because they valued European manufactured goods. So it was, and she, at one point, Catalina says they were all quiet as lambs. She's now, one of the really valuable records we have is when she was old, somebody interviewed her and asked her about the early days. And so we have some statements that she gives about the very earliest period. So they had good relations with the natives. And then eventually, after about 2 years, the Dutch soldiers in that region involved themselves. They violated their orders and they involved themselves in a dispute between the Mohican and the Mohawk tribes, and a couple of soldiers were killed. And so there was a leader who was further south of the Dutch people who were spread out very thinly, named Peter Minuit. And he decided this is dangerous. We have to rethink our strategy here. So he recalled everyone. And that's when he chose Manhattan Island as a good base for, this could be a city someday. And so they end up then as part of the first group building what would be New Amsterdam and ultimately New York.
And I think of how tough as nails she must have been. I mean, she lived into her 80s. She had like 11 children, back and forth in this rough terrain. It's a great story that you capture these stories that are so rich. It's so well done, Russell. I just thoroughly enjoyed it, particularly since it was I know there's another million or so of us, but particularly she's an ancestor of mine. But and she is actually still alive 40 years later when the English come knocking. But you pull out a couple of other little biographies that sort of represent some of the people who make up the citizens of New Amsterdam when the English arrived. One of them is a gentleman by the name of Asser Levy. Can you tell us about him?
Yeah, as I said, this was a very mixed community. One of the um, one of the populations, there was a small Jewish population. There were 24 Jewish members of the settlement in New Amsterdam. What made this mixed society possible was the Netherlands was unique in Europe in the 17th century in that it had an official policy of religious toleration. This is a time when intolerance was official policy in France, in Spain, in England, and it was common sense. The idea was it's an incredibly dangerous world, and religion is a very divisive force. So we want to have everyone in our community on the same page. So everybody had a state religion, and they actively discouraged others from settling. The Dutch did something different. They had an official policy of religious toleration, and they used kind of an opposite logic. They thought that rather than weakening the society, it would strengthen it. And in fact, lo and behold, this little country, the Dutch Republic, became probably the most powerful nation in the world for a period of time, built on global trade. And with that comes this, I think tolerance is a natural outflow of that, because when you're going to different parts of the world, you're learning different languages and seeing things from different perspectives. Um, so they had this mixed population, and and then when they had this colony in the New World, that kind of came along with it. Um, and then you have, so that here comes this group of Jews. Most of them came when the Dutch had a settlement in Brazil, which the Portuguese took over, and there was a Jewish population there. The Dutch tolerance meant that the Jews were able to live there. Under the Portuguese, they were not welcome. So they fled, and they wound up in New Amsterdam. Now, Peter Stuyvesant was, at this point, the leader of New Netherland, the Dutch colony. Stuyvesant himself was more like, he believed in the intolerance that other parts of Europe considered normal. He thought that he was, from his perspective, he's trying to govern this community in the middle of nowhere, in this wilderness of North America, and it's very dangerous, and he wants everyone to be on the same page. And as far as he's concerned, I mean, he was anti-Semitic in the way that was normal for white European Christians. Everybody was, thought Jews were, a despised people, and they were, they didn't recognize the divinity of Christ and all that. And he didn't want them. And so he tried to bar them from settling. And they appealed over his head. And indeed, they were told, Stuyvesant was overruled, and he was told, no, we have this policy of toleration. You have to put up with them. Nevertheless, he wanted to make life difficult for them. He wanted to try to force them out. There's a series of moves that he takes to try to make life unpleasant. Asser Levy the Jews apparently appointed Asser Levy to be their representative in combating this. And so repeatedly, Asser Levy appears in the records, kind of going into the fort where there was the council room, where Stuyvesant and his council sat in session. And he argues and says, whatever the most recent thing you're trying to do, here's why that is against the law and why we are petitioning to be able to do something different. One case, for example, there was the burgher right. To be a burgher was to be an official citizen of the city. So in this case, New Amsterdam, which came with certain things that you had to do. You had to pay a tax, and you had certain privileges that came with being a burgher. Stuyvesant taxed the Jews as burghers, but he didn't give them burgher status. So one of the things one of the privileges you had as a burgher was to march in the civic guard. If you think of Rembrandt's painting The Night Watch, that's a civic guard marching in the night, and they're all done up in their best outfits. And this was a way to show I'm a person of status in the community. And at one point, Asser Levy, on behalf of the Jews, issues this petition basically saying either don't tax us as burghers or let us march in the civic guard. You can't have it both ways. Stuyvesant comes back and says, too bad, that's the way it is. If you don't like it, leave. They petition again, and he's overruled, and he has to, and eventually they are given burgher status. So, it's a case of, as in American society at different eras, it's a civil rights story. You have a law that's, done for, there's a certain ideal or sense of justice or fairness in the law. But then you have rulers who decide, I'm going to just ignore the law. And then you have the legal system at play. And if things go well, then the law is upheld, and people can live a fuller life.
So the tolerant philosophy of the Dutch government was sort of a work in progress a little bit in New Amsterdam as far as Peter Stuyvesant was concerned, I guess, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Now, on that same note, there's another person that you talk about whose name was Dorothea Angola. Could you give us a little snippet about what she was about? Because she was also there in the colony in New Amsterdam at the point that the English arrive.
Yeah, that's and you're right that that's another civil rights story, you would say. And you, as you're what you're doing, what you're pointing out these people who are sort of minor figures in the book, and I weave their stories through the book as a way to, because the larger story here is this showdown between the English and the Dutch, but really it wasn't just the leaders. Everybody in the community of New Amsterdam was taking part in what was going to happen, whether they were going to go with the English or not. And Asa Levy was one, and Catalina Trico was one, and Dorothea Angola was as well. I think she was probably part of the first group of enslaved Africans to arrive in New Amsterdam in the year 1627. So just a year after New Amsterdam was founded. Um, I use her in the book partly to tell the story of slavery and what slavery was and was not in this moment because it wasn't an institution. There weren't laws about it. They were making it up as they went, and they seemed to take as their background for it. They seemed to be looking at the Bible and at ancient Rome, both of which there's slavery involved, and to some extent looking at indentured servitude in Europe. Indentured servitude, is this medieval system where you had no money and you would sign your life over to someone and you would work for that person. But the important thing would be you would do it for a set number of years, and then you would have won your freedom. You'd be out of you'd have gotten something out of it, and you'd have given your life, your labor, for a number of years. And so that seems to have been part of the way people were thinking about slavery in this period. So, slavery, first of all, was for most of the life of the Dutch colony was an ad hoc thing. It wasn't part of the initial philosophy behind this colony. The enslaved came from Spanish or Portuguese ships that the Dutch had captured. They were at war with them in the Caribbean, and then they brought them to New York Harbor because they knew there was a Dutch settlement there, and they just kind of dropped them off. And the numbers were quite small, in the dozens, not a lot of people. Nevertheless, they were, even though this is the early days and it wasn't clear cut, they were clearly the bottom rung of society. They were the people whose lives were not their own. They were owned by someone else. Um, Dorothea Angola, she was probably a teenager when she arrived. She marries another African. They have children. And then the two of them, together with with 10 other men, um, petition for their freedom. And they get it. And this is after, let me think, about 14 years, I think, of working in slavery. So they get freedom and they get land. Dorothy and her husband got 6 acres of land a couple of miles north of New Amsterdam. And her husband dies. She remarries. She has children. Eventually, she has grandchildren. So and now we're at the point 40 years later of the when the English ships are in the harbor. She's one of the ones on the scene. And you have to figure at this point that she is a person of some substance in the community. She owns 6 acres of land. And I plotted this on the grid of New York City today. In the streets, there's Sullivan, Thompson, McDougal, Bleecker, and I realized she basically owned Greenwich Village. And So she and the community around her, other freed Africans, they were given land in this same area, and it eventually became known as the land of the blacks. So it was this moment in New York history, and then after the English take over and it's New York, they for a time continue this way, and then a white man eventually buys up all of their land in one go. We don't know the circumstances, but surely they were forced to sell somehow. And that pretty much coincides with the beginning of the slave codes in what is now English New York and the real kind of development of slavery as this hard and fast system where if you're Africans You're not no more than three people are allowed to congregate. You can't go out freely at night, and so life becomes more and more restrictive.
Yeah, thank you for these stories, these smaller stories that make up these people who were there when this big showdown happened, which is what we're going to jump into now. So you got a multi-ethnic group. You've got a pretty high compared to Europe. Most countries in Europe, a pretty tolerant society. It's very commercial. There's a lot going on. It sounds like it's a pretty good place to be. Now take us to I think it's the summer of 1664, and let's go back to talking about Richard Nichols and who sent him and why.
Okay, yeah. So we've been talking about the Dutch side of the story. The English side, England in this period, through the whole 17th century, is kind of like our own, a society that is bitterly divided, and people just see the world fundamentally differently from one another. On the one side, you have the Puritans, who started to gain power in the beginning of the century. And by the middle of the century, they controlled Parliament. They were really dominant. And they believed that they knew what God wanted, and they wanted to recraft government and society in their image. On the other side, this comes to a head in the English Civil War, and the other side in the Civil War are called the Royalists, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer because some of them surely supported the royals, the monarchy, the Stuart government. But what really bound them together was they were anti-Puritan. They did not want the Puritans to take over and, as the Puritans eventually did, to outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater and things like that. So you have this mixed group of people who are moderates, and things come to a head literally in 1649 when the Puritans capture the king, Charles I. They behead him, and you have the English Civil War, now the vicious civil war. The king's two young sons, the princes, flee into exile on the continent, Charles and James, and a group of people loyal to them go with them. One of them is Richard Nichols, who, I was fascinated about the more I explored him as I got into this story. Histories of early New York write about, they mention Richard Nichols as the one who led the English force and then took over and, becomes the first governor of New York. And that's kind of all they say. I spent a lot of time researching his early life. So who was this person that they entrusted with this mission? It turns out that these two young royal princes knew him their whole lives. When they were children, their father, the king, would go frequently to a little village in Bedfordshire called Ampthill because the royal hunting ground was around it. And they would stay at the lodge, which was the home of the keeper of the hunting ground. And the keeper of the hunting ground was Richard Nichols' father. And Richard Nichols then knew them from they grew up together. I mean, he wasn't at the same status, the same level, but they knew each other forever. And then, as I say, when they are in the war, he's fighting alongside them. When they go into exile, he goes with them. So eventually, the Civil War ends. The Stuarts come back to the throne, and the older of the brothers, Charles, becomes Charles II, and James, the Duke of York, is his right hand. He's the Lord of the Admiralty, and it's James who is particularly close to Richard Nichols. So now they want to build an empire. They look across the Atlantic and they see this Dutch piece of the American colonies, and there's two missions. One is they want someone who can take that Dutch colony, and the second mission concerns New England. New England was English and had been for decades, but it was founded by and ruled by the Puritans, the same people who had just cut off their father's head and who hated their Stuart guts. The Puritans were most deeply opposed to the Church of England, which they thought was utterly corrupt. And the king was the head of the Church of England. So by definition, they despised the Stuarts. So that was almost probably an even bigger problem for them than the Dutch colony. So they appointed Richard Nicolls and gave him two missions in America. They gave him four ships, 450 soldiers. The ships were packed with gunpowder and weapons, and they just told him go figure it out because he's not able to phone home once he's there and say here's the situation. So it was a lot of responsibility to just sort this all out. So he sails first then into, well, no, actually, he goes first to Boston and has this very brittle meeting with the Puritan elders there who are cagey. They don't outright say, screw you and screw the king, but they promise nothing. They won't, they're very, they're playing fast and loose with language, and he goes away feeling, very unsettled about the possibility of them professing their fealty to the monarchy. And he basically says, I'll be back. And then he goes south to Manhattan, to the Dutch colony, and he sails into the harbor in the late summer in August of 1664. And his mission then is to figure out how to take this Dutch colony. And as I said, he was loaded with weapons, and he's a hardened soldier, and that is the logical, violence is the logical way to do it. But by this time, he has done a lot of homework. He started in London. He started interviewing people who had lived in the Dutch colony, and he started to get an idea of what was going on there, and he was really intrigued by it. So essentially, the Dutch had brought two things. They had brought this notion of tolerance or toleration, and they had brought the building blocks of what we would call capitalism. They pioneered the notion of shares of stock. Of this way of spreading around risk in company, and in particularly in voyages that were very hazardous. So these two things, this mixed society and this new economic force, are working in a very novel way in this place called Manhattan. And he finds this intriguing, and he comes to feel that he doesn't want to just blast away and wipe out the Dutch colony. And, then he's left with this island, which is strategically interesting. But he wants this thing that they have, and he knows that it exists only in the minds of this community, this mixed community at the tip of Manhattan Island. And this is really what the book is mostly about, this diplomatic dance between Richard Nicolls and Peter Stuyvesant, who is the leader of the Dutch forces. And what I spent a lot of time trying to do was get in their heads. What do they each want? And because when you read these, so what they're doing, Nicolls anchors in Gravesend Bay, the tip of Long Island, in the harbor, and he sends messengers on a boat to New Amsterdam, to the fort. They give a message to Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant reads it. He writes a reply. Messengers come back, and this is what they're doing, this back and forth. And some of these notes are very blustery and fiery, and we're, in 24 hours, we're opening fire, blah, blah, blah. And then other notes are, much more nuanced. So they're feeling each other out. And as I said, Stuyvesant knows, and all of his population know, that they're on their own. They're not getting help from the Dutch government. They haven't for years. And Nicolls comes to know that too, because he's got spies and he's learning what's going on, and he wants this thing. So ultimately, what they work out is what in the book I call a kind of merger. They decide something together, not just these two leaders, but also all those people we were talking about, Dorothy Angola and Asser Levy and Catalina Trico. All these people are somehow or other involved in this. because they're all, I mean, if you've ever been, New Amsterdam is now the financial district of New York. And if you're ever there, down there in the financial district, or the Battery Park at the tip of the island, you look, you can see the Brooklyn shore there, the East River. That's where the English soldiers were lined up on the shore there. You can see the harbor there where the English ships were. So they're there. You can imagine these 1,500 inhabitants, and they're like communicating with each other. They're yelling at Stuyvesant and his council, so they're all making their voices heard. So ultimately, what they did, they worked out a merger agreement. They decided in this trade-off, in these negotiations, Stuyvesant and the Dutch said, if we give over to you, if this is going to become an English city, here's what we want. And they're given everything that they want. They want a list of guarantees, and the guarantees are that they will keep their homes, their families, their businesses, their trade networks. The Dutch ships will keep coming in. So what that ensures is that this new city, which Nichols is going to name New York, will be elementally Dutch. It will keep those features. It will keep, and because of that, it'll have this multi-ethnic, tolerant kind of social glue. And it will have this, the word capitalism wouldn't come into being for a couple of centuries, but it will have this economic component to it, but it will become English. And then Nichols becomes the first governor. He decides what to name. He writes the Duke of York and says, I gave this place the name New York. I just thought that had a nice ring to it. So that's basically how it develops.
Nichols is just a huge contributor to history, and to think what a minor name he's been as far as maybe I've come across his name in a book or two in the past. I would say there's very, very few people who would know how big a player he was. But one of the things that struck me during that back and forth, the negotiations, that was so interesting because I think he had two case studies in leadership, really. Both men were dealing with huge pressures. They were on their own. I mean, they were calling the shots. Nichols, of course, he had these two. It seems like one of the missions, the one of going up and dealing with the Puritans, was almost like a lose-lose situation. I'm not sure how he was going to come away with anything there, but then to come down and say, okay, now I got to go take over New Amsterdam. Um, but I think when you mentioned that Nichols got a lot of intelligence, he was able to gather intelligence going into it, because if he didn't gather it ahead of time, then he was just going to deal right on the spot when he's already got his cannons pointed at Stuyvesant. So I think a lot of kudos to Nichols, but also Stuyvesant on his side. He was dealing. I understand that when the British arrived, the English arrived, that Stuyvesant was actually up the Hudson River in I guess near what was now Albany, trying to settle some treaty issues with the native tribes, and he was dealing with that. He was dealing with the people of the town who didn't want their city to be attacked. His soldiers, it sounded like, wanted to fight. And then he had to worry about what the West India Company would think if he surrendered, of what the Dutch government would say. He had to balance all those things. And it may have been in his mind that he was damned if he did, damned if he didn't, because wouldn't he have been, wasn't he called to account for surrendering the city, in effect?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. They both had a lot on the line, and they had to decide on their own. They couldn't wait months for, to send a message about what's going on to the home country and then wait for a return message. In Stuyvesant's case, the way I kind of reasoned it out in the book, just again trying to get into his head, he was an officer of the Dutch West India Company, which officially governed the colony. The Dutch system, the Dutch kind of outsourced their foreign policy to these two big corporations. The East India Company, it had Asia, and the West India Company had the Americas. And so he had a loyalty to the West India Company and orders to defend this place. He also had loyalty he owed to the Dutch government for the same reasons, the same jurisdiction. And according to both of those, he would defend it to the end. However, I think what he ultimately decided was he had tried for years to get them to support it, and they just gave him a cold shoulder. So he decides ultimately, with the very vigorous encouragement of the population, that he has another loyalty, and that is to this place, to New Amsterdam, to the colony of New Netherland, to the thousands of people that lived there. He had been the director for 17 years. He had raised two sons there, he and his wife, Judith. He felt very much that he had created this. I mean, I'm talking about this system that they created there. A colleague of mine, Dennis Micah, has done a lot of research and is writing a book about the development of this new kind of merchant society in New Amsterdam. And he gives a lot of credit to Stuyvesant for being the one to realize that he is in this position of a go-between between the West India Company and the bosses in Europe. They're never going to come to America. They don't really get it, you know. And on the ground in New Amsterdam, he's got this population of traders, and they're all, they're like typically a trading company, a small trading company in Amsterdam would send one of their sons to open a branch office in New Amsterdam, and they were doing vibrant business. So they wanted to take things one way. The West India Company was pulling another direction, and Stuyvesant, as a middleman, sets up this very interesting system, which would become the basis. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Wall Street was the northern boundary of New Amsterdam. I mean, that's to this day, the financial center of not just New York, but of America. So Stuyvesant, was part of all that. So he's, all of this he feels ownership of, like this is, something he created, and he ultimately decides that the best way to give this a future is to give it up, to give it to the English, but to do it under the best terms possible. Hence these negotiations. And so New York becoming what it did is in large measure due to this creative thinking on the part of these people.
How much do you think Stuyvesant know about Nichols and what King Charles II at that point were going to do with New York? It seems that Nichols had some intelligence on the city of New Amsterdam about what they were about. But how much did Stuyvesant know about what would happen when the English got there?
I don't think anybody knew what was going to happen, but he knew a lot about England and what was going on in England and in New England to his north. He knew very well that Nichols represented the other side. He was not the Puritans. He knew the difference between the Puritans in New England and the Stuart government. He knew, the Stuarts, when they got on the throne, one of the first things they did was set up this kind of corporation to develop empire. They also they've set up the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science. Nichols and Stuyvesant both were very interested in these kind of scientific matters, and they then became part of this little group of men who were trading letters across the Atlantic. This extended into the New York period, about scientific discoveries, about minerals in the New World, and so that he was interested in those things. He knew, so I think he felt these English are people that they are more like us. They think a little bit more like us. They're more pragmatic. That said, he didn't know what it was going to be, of course. But I think the most telling thing about him is that, as you mentioned before, once this is all done, the Dutch government recalls Stuyvesant and puts him on trial for, giving up this colony that he was charged with. And he brings, cases of documents with him, and he gets soldiers to sign affidavits and things to support, basically saying, look, we wanted to defend it, but we needed your help, and let us to hang out to dry. Eventually, he's exonerated, and then the most telling thing of all about Stuyvesant, I think, is what does he do? He goes back to New York and he lives out his days there, which proves that he truly, ultimately was an American. He was a New Yorker. He had decided this is, yes, the English have it and they have it under these terms that we arranged, and that's my home and I'm going back there.
Can you visit his grave?
Yeah, yeah, that's actually how I got started in all of this 20 some years ago. My daughter was a toddler and we lived in the East Village of New York, and I took her the nearest open space for her to run around was the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery. And that church was originally Stuyvesant's family chapel, and his tomb is in the foundation there. And there is a statue and a plaque marking it. And in fact, once I got into this, then I went back and looked at the plaque again. And I realized I think there were four errors on the plaque. Um, but yeah, that's how I got going in it.
One of the other things I admire Stuyvesant for is the fact that by nature, for what you said in the book, he was a hothead. He could tend to be a hothead. So he was probably fighting that nature while he was negotiating with Nichols. Also, he was a soldier. He was used to doing battle. So he lost his leg, I think you mentioned. And so he had to sort of fight that to best support the people who he was governing. And I think that that is admirable. And can you give a little postscript on Nichols?
Yeah, Nichols, I said the telling thing about Stuyvesant is he ends up being going back and being a New Yorker. Nichols, after 4 years, decides he's had enough, and he asks to be, reassigned. And he goes back, and then in 1672, the next war with the Dutch is gearing up, and he is on a ship at the Battle of Sol Bay, and he's killed in battle by the Dutch, of all things. They both died in 1672. Stuyvesant was considerably older, but Nichols, the thing that I think drove him crazy and made him decide after 4 years, I'm done here, was James Nichols had these plans for the whole colony, and New Netherland at that time, as we said at the outset, encompassed New Jersey as well, the other side of the Hudson River. And he had plans for that. And if you think of New York Harbor, it's this one entity. That's how he saw it. He wanted to develop it. Then he gets a letter from James saying he has given that west side to a friend of his who had been the governor of the island of Jersey. So that's now going to be his, and he's going to call it New Jersey. And this really messed up Nichols' plans. He feels like his own boss is, messing up the plans for developing the place. So he, writes to him repeatedly and says, please don't do this. And at one point he says, why don't you give your friend Delaware? Delaware's a nice place, but he doesn't want to do it. It's already done. And and Nichols actually had already named New Jersey. He was going to call it Albania of all things, because James was also the Duke of Albany. But it didn't fly. Of course, he named Albany the capital of New York. But it didn't fly, and that just drove him to distraction. I think that's what. But Nichols he never married. He was kind of a soldier to the last, and he's a very curious fellow. I found some records. Well, in his will, for example, he gives a lot in those days. Soldiers had a lot of their property in rings, like gold rings, different valuations of jewelry. So he gives rings of different values to some people. One, he gives a very valuable ring to this woman. I couldn't find out much about her. Was she someone he was interested in? There's a lot about him that I just couldn't figure out. An intriguing figure, and as you say, someone who is very consequential, but not known, not well known.
Yeah, I was thinking before speaking to you, I got to ask Russell this hypothetical question. In your studying of the negotiations and that sort of tense period back and forth between Nichols and Stuyvesant, what do you think could have happened or would have happened if there were two different men in those positions, and it say the English opened fire and went to battle to take over New Amsterdam. What do you think might have happened? How would that have maybe played out? Not just immediately, but maybe we talk about New York sort of being a model of maybe future American system. What might have happened, do you think?
I think, the historical what ifs are always a little bit like venturing into science fiction because, you
I
change
know.
one thing and everything else, suddenly
Couldn't resist.
maybe in our time we'd all be wearing, blue hats or something. Who knows what things would change. But one thing that could have happened, the Dutch soldiers in these affidavits that Stuyvesant got them to fill out, they said we were ready to fight and we could have won. We're seasoned soldiers. They said they were looking out across the East River. They saw these English, Nichols had put out the word on Long Island, all these English farmers there to come to his aid. They said we were looking at these guys. They're just farmers standing there with like pitchforks and things. Like we know we would have wiped them out. One scenario is Nichols opens fire. It's easier to defend than to attack. And the Dutch succeed in defending, and maybe that then causes the home country to take notice and they reinforce the colony. And maybe that whole colony in New Netherland was not just New York, it was New York, New Jersey, parts of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Maybe that remains a Dutch entity, and then the English colonies build around it. And maybe since I'm just speculating here, maybe since the English colonies are not, I mean, New England is separate then from further south from Maryland and Virginia and all that. Maybe they never, in the next century, align and rebel against the home country. So maybe now you and I would be speaking Dutch, and we would be in New Netherland, and we would have New England neighbors, and who knows?
Isn't this fun though, Russell? Really? It's
Alternate history, yeah.
so Russell, did I hear that you were actually knighted by the Netherlands?
Yeah, they have a system, kind of knighthood system. They call it the Dutch are much more kind of low key about these things than the English are. So they call it a lintje, which is like a little ribbon, So yeah, I was given a little ribbon in 2009 for my work on sort of Dutch American history.
Oh, that's terrific. What an honor.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful, and it's you're also given instructions on what kind of events you're supposed to wear it at. So anytime you're in the presence of the king and queen, for example, you wear your ribbon.
Well, I've never spoken with a knight before, so this is an honor for me.
Well, I'm equally honored, James.
And of course, you've got other things that you're doing that are related to your Dutch studies.
In New York, I'm the director of the New Amsterdam project at the New York Historical, formerly the New York Historical Society. I'm also affiliated with the New Netherland Institute in Albany, which is where they publish the translations of the Dutch colonial records. And I have a long affiliation with the Netherlands and with Amsterdam and different institutions there.
Obviously, you've done a lot of traveling over to the Netherlands and your research and everything, and it's just amazing work that you do, Russell. What's next?
What's next? I'm working on a book. I'm working on a book idea. I'm not quite ready to talk about. It's more on the Dutch side of this history again, and it's in the 17th century. And I'm developing at the New York Historical for next year. I'm curating a museum exhibit that will be called Old Masters and New Amsterdam, and we're bringing 60 Dutch Old Master paintings, Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and others, with the idea that there weren't many painters in New Amsterdam, so we don't have much of a sense of what it looked like. But we can use, by selectively picking the works of the Dutch Old Masters, tavern scenes, market scenes, things like that, we can use them to get a sense of what it looked like.
Well, fantastic. This is great work. The book, Taking Manhattan, was just, as I said, it was a page turner, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And also learning those little stories about my ancestors and what they were up against. It was that was an extra bonus. But just the tension that you built up in that whole process. I didn't know any of that as far as what almost happened,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Thank you again, Russell. And I hope that we'll be interviewing you again sometime for your next book that comes out.
Yeah, James, thank you very much for a very thoughtful interview. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, Russell.
Much appreciated.
Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.